today we're going to take a look at chapter 2 of Ruth, and we're going to see how living lives of everyday faith create oases in the midst of our culture, in the midst of our surroundings, in the midst of our lives of hope and love and joy. What an appropriate message for today. You know, if just everyday people like we are, living lives of everyday faith like we do, then we are actually helping to create a place where wounded people can feel safe and secure, where brokenness can be mended and healing balm can be put on it, where joy can be found in the midst of struggle and suffering. And today is not much different than the period of time when Ruth and Boaz and Naomi were living, because remember, that was those times like the Judges where everybody did as they saw fit. And so all around this group of people, there is all kinds of corruptness. There's all kinds of hurt and pain and abuse happening. And as I was reading about that stuff and looking at the headlines this week, I mean, we see all the scandals coming out against everybody that's been accused of doing something in their past, and you can't help but think, man, everybody here in this world in this day is kind of doing as they see fit too. So this becomes even more important when we have family members, church family members that are struggling with things, when we look around us and we see the abuse that's happened maybe in some of your own lives in the past, and you know, and you might have friends that's all coming back to the surface, or maybe they're just going through that. Whatever it is, like as believers of Jesus, we have to get very specific and very intentional about this message, this gospel message, because it truly is the hope of the world. And it doesn't require a great deal of effort on our part. It requires a little bit of effort, I'm not going to lie to you there, but it should be a byproduct of how we're living our lives anyway. So everyday faith is something that people that believe Jesus, that follow God, we're capable of, through our everyday faith, creating oases of hope and love and joy through our lives. How? Right? How do we do that? Well, I'm glad you asked, because that's what we're going to talk about today. So you ready?
Yeah.
Ruth chapter 2. Ruth chapter 2 verse 1. Remember where we are in this account, okay? So Naomi takes her family to Moab with her husband to flee a famine that was happening in Bethlehem. Her husband dies. Her sons marry. The sons die. She's left with 2 daughters-in-law. One is Ruth, the other is Orpah or something like that. I always forget that lady's name, sorry. But Orpah. And so I always want to say Oprah. But it's, yeah, it's not Oprah, it's Orpah. Anyway, so Naomi decides she's going to move back to Bethlehem, and Ruth says, I'm going with you. Don't tell me to stay. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. Your homeland will be my homeland. Like, we are in this together. And so Naomi shuts up. And they travel back to Bethlehem. So here we are with these 2 widows that again, in this culture, there's not a lot of good that happens to widows in this culture, especially when it's as corrupt as we hear that it has been, okay? So they, as in those 2, are in the place, in Bethlehem. And now what? What do? You gotta eat. You gotta eat. So this is where we open. Ruth says to Naomi, let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor. She didn't wait for Naomi to tell her what to do. Remember, Naomi's the mother-in-law. And a lot of times you daughters-in-law, you don't do anything until your mother-in-law tells you to do it, right?
Yeah, that's how that works.
But Ruth, she's industrious. She's a hard worker. We already know that she's super committed to Naomi, and I believe that part of the reason that she came is to support her mother-in-law because she loved her so much. So she gets up one morning, she's like, you know what, Mom? I'm going to go out to the field, and I'm going to provide for us. Let me go to the field and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor. Now, here's what we learn about this particular time. God knew. In fact, there are some things throughout God's Word that tell us exactly what we need to do to be faithful and obedient to Him. You know what it is? Take care of the orphans, take care of the widows, and those in prison. Like, pretty straightforward. He doesn't hide what He wants us to do. So in this particular case, you've got a couple of widows that are moving back to Bethlehem. In order for His widows, God's widows, to be provided for, He put some rules in place back in Leviticus and Deuteronomy that were gleaning rules. Now, we don't know a lot about gleaning. A lot of times if you hear the word gleaning in a sentence, it's because somebody got a great idea or they learned something new from something, right? But in this particular day, there was a gleaning law in place, which said that widows had the right to follow harvesters through the field. And whatever the harvesters missed, the widows could pick up and they could take it home. The poor and oppressed, it didn't just have to be widows, but anybody, any class that was poor or oppressed could walk through the field behind the harvesters when they make one clean sweep through and pick up anything that was left over. It's pretty cool, right? So oftentimes, landowners would actually leave the edges of their field for the poor among them. Again, if you were generous, that's what you do. But remember, we're living in the time of the judges where everybody did as they saw fit. So there wasn't a lot of generosity happening at that time. So in this culture of corruption, there's an oasis of generosity and hope and love being created by people with faith. Watch what happens. She says, I'm going to go into the field behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor. And Naomi says, go ahead, daughter, go ahead. So verse 3 says, so Ruth went out and she enters a field and began to glean behind the harvesters. And as it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. Elimelech was Naomi's husband. So this tribe, this clan of family members, cousins and second cousins, first removed, and just the whole family tree, like they're all part of a family. And as it happens, Ruth winds up in Boaz's field. Coincidences happen, right? And it's really easy for us to go through life and take a look at some sort of favor that we may find with somebody and go, well, that was a great coincidence. That was good luck. Hey, I've got some favor with somebody. It's because of my... But what we have to see here is that in all of Bethlehem, Ruth happens. She doesn't know her way around. She's not from Bethlehem. She happens to wind up in a relative's field, as it turned out. I think the author puts that in there a little bit for us just to remind us that this God that we serve is not surprised by coincidences. He's not just allowing them to happen like, oh yeah, that's a coincidence. No! Everything that happens, God is involved in. There's no coincidences with God. And so I think the author throws that in there just to kind of tickle your brain a little bit, to make you think about, was it? No. And here's why. Because as Boaz arrived in the field from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters, the Lord be with you. The Lord bless you, they answered back. We see a difference here. Boaz is not just some landowner that's hard on his employees. Anybody ever worked for a difficult boss that was just about the bottom line? Did he ever walk into your office and be like, hey guys, how's it going? Or was he like, get your numbers in? I worked for one of those for a while.
You're looking at me?
Well, because I think you might know who I was talking about. So, again, there are different types of people, and what we see about Boaz here, and what we learn about Boaz if you go through all of the verses, we're going to save some again today, is that Boaz was a great man of faith. He was an everyday person. He was wealthy. He was well respected in his community. He had a great deal of influence. And the word that's used of him in the original text is he was a man of valor. And as you study, especially in the Old Testament times, those words are used of very specific people. Men of valor, men of valor, men of valor. What does that mean? It means that they were mighty. Oftentimes they were warriors. I don't know if Boaz was or not. But they had high influence and were well regarded in their communities. So Boaz, this man of great influence, walks onto his property and says to all of his workers, all of his harvesters, "The Lord be with you." And their natural response is, "And the Lord bless you," they answer. So Boaz shows up, he looks around, there's a new woman on his property. He's like, "Who is this lady?" And he asks the overseer, and the overseer's like, "That's Ruth. Remember, she came with Naomi back from Moab." And Boaz is like, "Oh, okay, cool, she's here." And so watch what happens next. Again, Boaz says to Ruth, he goes over after the overseer tells her in verse 8, and he says, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting, and follow along after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you. And whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled." Again, we may read over this, and it might not have any consequence to our mindset at all. But remember what's happening in this day and age. Women were mistreated and abused. They were in danger of being raped and beaten. They were not highly regarded, and especially a woman alone was one that had to be extra diligent to protect herself from attacks or other things. And so when Boaz says to her daughter, "Stay in my field, stay with my servants, follow the women, and be safe," what he's saying is, "I'm going to have you protected as long as you're here." And not only that, he goes above and beyond and says, "Anytime you're thirsty, go and get some water." He's treating her like one of his own servants. And she says, "Why?" Verse 10. At this, she bows down with her face to the ground. She understands what he's doing for her. She asks him, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" Why? Well, Boaz replies, verse 11, "I've been told all about what you've done. I've been told all about it. What you've done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland, and you came to live with a people you did not know before. I know all that you've done." See, what he's responding to her questions, "Why are you throwing open the doors of generosity to me?" Boaz. He says, "Because your reputation precedes you. Your reputation is opening these doors. Your integrity, your character, I know who you are. I can see what matters to you. And because of that, you have influence with me. And it's going to open doors for you. Please come and do what you need to do here." And he goes on to say in verse 12, "May the Lord repay you for what you've done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." See, she had made this commitment to Naomi and to Naomi's God. And by doing that, what we see in the Old Testament language of God is oftentimes he's portrayed as this bird that spreads out its wings to protect its young and its flock. I don't know if you flock, yeah. And it says, "I'm going to cover you with my wings, and I'm going to care for you like even nature knows how to do." And so what Boaz is praying over her, and this is kind of a prayer like, "May the Lord bless you. May he give you favor. May he protect you, under whose wings you've chosen to come and hide." He's saying your commitment to God has said that you have chosen to allow him to protect you. And may he prove faithful in that. Now what I think is interesting here is that Boaz, making this declaration, this prayer over Ruth, is actually going to become the one who answers his own prayers. And oftentimes, in our own lives, I think God stirs up something inside of us to pray for somebody else. And oftentimes, he uses the ones that are praying for someone to be the ones that are the answers to those prayers. Don't be surprised if you become an answer. This whole language of wings is going to come back in chapter 3 and 4. So hold on to that thought. Maybe circle that in your paper Bibles if you have them. Boaz is asking that this God that she chose to commit her life to, that she's taken so many risks for, would prove faithful to her. That he would reward her so that her faith would be strengthened. And that she would see that her needs are met. Now watch what happens next. Verse 13. She says back to Boaz, "May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my Lord? You've put me at ease by speaking kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servants." She humbles herself before Boaz. The next few verses in the chapter, verses 14 through 16, basically it's lunchtime. So he invites her to come and eat with them, and he creates this great meal, and he actually serves her. So I'm imagining that he's a little bit smitten at this point. This young woman shows up in your field, but what we learn later on is Boaz is quite a bit older than Ruth, so he's probably not going to make any moves. It would probably be inappropriate at this point. And so he just wants to serve her and bless her, and he gives her a whole bunch of food for lunch, so much so that she doesn't eat it all. She packs it in her lunchbox and takes it home with her later on. And behind her back, he tells his harvesters, leave a few extra stalks out. Leave a few extra. Okay? So we see him go from just kind to incredibly and increasingly generous to this woman who he's just met. And the other thing that I think stands out and should be noted is I think Ruth probably arrived in this field early in the morning when the harvesters came. I imagine that like any good boss, he probably showed up a little bit later than his servants did in the field. Okay? And so probably she's been out there for a while. He sees what she's doing. And he's like, wow, look at all she's collected. She's industrious. And he asks and he calls her over and they eat lunch together and he sends her back out into the field. And she, verse 17 says that she gleaned in the field until evening. And then she threshed the barley that she had gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah. Now, from morning, it says, I'm guessing, it doesn't really say how early, but I'm guessing it was pretty early. If you guys will give me that courtesy of guessing on that, I mean, it makes sense. And then it says that she stayed there until evening. And then she goes to the threshing floor, which is a different place so that the wind could come through. It was either up on a hill or positioned in a valley someplace so that the wind would blow through, and you would basically beat the stalks so that the grains would stay and the stalks would blow away, kind of like leaves in the wind. And so she waits until later on in the day, after she's gathered all this stuff, and she goes in there, and it's about an ephah. Well, I know that when you guys go to the market, you're probably going to the checkout counter and say to the lady that's trying to check you out. Again, I've been called out on how often I go to the grocery store recently because I use these grocery store analogies a lot and I don't go to the grocery store. But I can't imagine that you'd ever stand in front of the checker that's checking you out. And so how many? See, I hate self-checkout, by the way. I hate it. But, because it never works for me. I always have to have the attendant come over and help anyway. So why not just go through the one with the person in line? Anyway. There's nothing in the bagging area. I put it in the bagging area!
So you're FO free for the bagging area?
Yes. She says, how much did you get? I said, an ephah. And she's like, what's that? Because nobody knows these days, right? Well, anybody know? Maybe your Bible has a note. 30 to 40 pounds. Okay? 30 to 40 pounds of grain. That's after she's winnowed it out and threshed it out and let it all. 30 to 40 pounds. And I was thinking about this, like how many bags of flour would that be? How much flour is in a bag of flour? Oh, those are 5 pounds. Okay, so, for me, like, I'm not going to carry 30 pounds of flour around. I'm going to put it in a shopping cart. Well, she doesn't have a shopping cart. She carried it back home. She's a tough woman. She's been out from morning to night. She's done everything that she needed to do. She gathered. What I learned about this is that 30 to 40 pounds of grain was about 2 weeks' salary for a harvester. This woman is not like a dainty flower, okay? She's a hard worker. She's a hard worker. And she carries it back home, it says in verse 18. Now, 2 things. If you're a landowner and you see 2 weeks' worth of salary leave your store or your field that's unpaid for, you probably, unless you're incredibly generous and maybe a little bit smitten, are going to say something. So his generosity and her hard work. She carries it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered. This is enough to feed them for several weeks. And Ruth also brought out and gave her what she had left over after she had eaten enough. Remember, Boaz served her lunch, and she took it home to her mother-in-law. Speaking of like how much she was thinking of Naomi, and caring for Naomi and giving of herself. Because I'm pretty sure the stuff that she ate for lunch with Boaz was not, she's probably used to like peanut butter and jelly. Not even the crunchy kind. And Boaz is probably serving pretty good lunch, so she could have eaten it all. But she takes it home to her mother-in-law. And remember, Naomi says to the women in town, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, because I left feeling full, and I've returned being empty and bitter towards God because of what he's done. And watch. She carries it back. Her mother-in-law sees how much she has, and Ruth brought and gave her what she had left over for lunch and after she'd eaten enough. Verse 19 says, her mother-in-law asks, now watch, where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you. Because we were empty and now we're full. Her attitude is changing because of what Ruth has done. Because of what Ruth had. She had favor. She had hope. She went out going, I'm going to try to find a field owner that will show me some favor. And she comes back 10 times probably what they expected. And Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she'd been gleaning. The name of the man that I worked with today was Boaz. I still don't know for sure that Ruth has any idea who this guy is. Verse 20. The Lord bless him, Naomi said to her daughter. The Lord has not stopped showing his kindness. Remember that word for kindness? Loyal love. How, if your key characteristic is loyal love, do you stop loving? It violates who you are. Loyal love never ends. But sometimes our perception of it changes when things are hard, right? But loyal love never ends. The Lord bless him, Naomi says to her daughter. He's not stopped showing us his kindness to the living and to the dead. And here's why. To the dead, she added. The man is our close relative. He is one of our guardian redeemers. Some of your translations might have kinsman redeemers in there. People that have grown up in the church know this more as the kinsman redeemer phrase than guardian redeemer. In fact, I wish that this translation didn't use that word at this place, but it doesn't matter. Because kinsman and guardian kind of means the same thing. There is also Old Testament obligations for tribal members in order to continue the family name, to continue the tribe, to provide some kind of justice, and to make sure that things are taken care of. There was this code that was the kinsman redeemer code. Now, all of this may seem a little bit arbitrary, but remember, with God, nothing is. And all the way from the beginning, God had a plan in place. He had a plan, and he knew that this guardian redeemer idea was going to be part of it. And so here's what I've written down about the guardian redeemer law or obligation. It wasn't really a law, it was just expected. If you didn't follow through on it, you were kind of looked down on, okay? So, each member of a family or tribe had an obligation to defend and provide for another member of that family that found themselves a victim of injustice, found themselves in hardship, or were destitute. Okay, so here's what that means. There are four things that a kinsman redeemer was responsible for. Avenging a murder. If somebody in your family was murdered, it wasn't an accident, it was murder, your responsibility was to get justice for your family. If you were under a great deal of obligation, a debt, you could sell yourself into servitude. Okay? So oftentimes when we read the word slavery in our Bibles, the word is basically servitude, where because you owed so much, that you would be an indentured servant to pay back what you owed. So if one of your family members sold themselves into servitude as a kinsman redeemer, your responsibility was to go and redeem that person. These words were very familiar in this time because it happened a lot. Okay? The third thing that they were supposed to do is if you fell on hard times, you could sell your property. And if you sold your property to somebody outside the family, the kinsman redeemer's responsibility was to buy back the property. Again, all of this is designed to protect his family. Remember, the 12 tribes of Israel, they were not the largest people group on the face of the planet. So God was protecting his people. So that was one of the ways that he did it. If you wind up in a great deal of student debt and you had to sell all of your family's land to pay back your student debt, let's say, the kinsman redeemer's responsibility was to buy the land back to keep it in the family. And fourthly, and this is when it gets a little bit weird, if you were a woman who hadn't had a male child and your husband died and he was part of that family tribe, the kinsman redeemer's responsibility was to marry you, the woman, and have a male heir, so that the property and the family name could continue. Again, God's protecting these 12 tribes. Okay. Those are the rules at play. So when Ruth goes, just happens to you, right? I'll turn left instead of right today and wind up in a providential, God-ordained, divine appointment and call it coincidence. Just happens to you. When Ruth winds up in Boaz's field and comes home with this incredible amount of generosity from Boaz, Naomi's first thought is, oh, he's a relative. He's a relative. Now, Naomi still had property in Bethlehem. It doesn't look like it's been sold yet. Okay? And so all of a sudden the big wheels keep on turning in Naomi's mind and her joy returns. Now, if you're a mother and you see someone showing your daughter favor and you know that God is involved, it changes everything. There's a little question box that starts blinking in the back of your mind going, wonder what God's up to here, wonder what God's up to. And some of you don't have daughters that are marrying age yet, but I promise you, when you do, that little light is going to start doing this more and more and more, okay? Now, Naomi, her light's going on. And I can just see her going, but you got to come back next week to see what happens. So, Ruth says to her mother-in-law, he even said to me to stay with his workers until they finished harvesting all of the grain, verse 21, which doesn't always translate well to us, but the barley harvest and the wheat harvest took about 4 months to harvest. So what's happening here is Boaz is saying, stay in my fields for the next 4 months as two single widowed women. Your immediate future is all of a sudden taken care of. You know you're going to have enough bread to eat between now and then. And maybe a little beer. Because there's barley. Maybe, I don't know. So verse 22 through 23, Naomi tells Ruth to stay in the field, and they've got about 4 months to get there. Close chapter 2. I'm telling you, you picked the wrong week to leave. This is our last week with us this week, and next week we get to see all of the resolution. But in the meantime, I'm going to go back to what we started out with this morning, talking about everyday people living lives of everyday faith, create an oasis of hope and joy and love in the midst of a corrupt society, in the midst of an unbelieving generation, in the midst of the headlines that keep hitting us that is bad news after bad news after bad news. This is why we do what we do. We believe. And out of that, out of our normal everyday activities in our everyday lives, things change. How? Well, Ruth, Boaz, and Naomi, these three people give us some incredible things to look at through their words and actions that teach us how our everyday faith, like theirs, can create an oasis. Because I hope you see that, like Boaz through his generosity. Naomi's noticing that all of a sudden, out of coincidence, God is providing something for them. Well, here's what I know. The things that we see over and over and over and over and over again in this chapter is they've got good reputations. They've got good reputations. Boaz is a man of valor. He's well respected. Ruth, he doesn't even really know who she is, but word has traveled fast because when he asks his overseer who that woman is, the overseer has a glowing review about Ruth. And the next thing you know, Boaz eats lunch with her. She's like, how have I found so much good favor with you? And he's like, because your reputation precedes you. Because I've seen the character inside of you. Because I know what you care about. You're living, you're not stealing, you're not doing anything. You are living a life of character and integrity. In the next chapter, you're going to see that he even applauds her for not chasing after a man more like her age. But following through on this God-ordained way to take care of things. His good reputation allows her to trust him. You'll see that in the next chapter too. Good reputations open opportunities for God to work through you. If we have a bad reputation, look, you can only lose trust a couple of times before you lose the relationship. And it's vitally important that as we live our lives, we're living our lives recognizing that every relationship matters. And God's Word tells us, as far as it has to do with you, as much as you can possibly do, bring peace and live at peace with everybody. Why? Because God understands that His Word and His love and His revelation comes through relationship. That's how He chose to do it. Remember, we're being built up into a living, breathing building as living stones, like the original when we looked at that a couple of weeks ago, okay? So our good reputations give us influence with people, and it opens up doors of opportunities to share God's love with people. So it's important to know your story. Because at some point when you're living a good reputation, a door of opportunity is going to open for you to share why you believe what you believe. This is important. Now, not everybody in God's Word had a good reputation. Matthew, Zacchaeus, the woman at the well. I mean, there's a lot of people that's lives were completely changed upside down through encountering Jesus too. And so if you don't have a good reputation, it's okay. It's okay. But once you know Jesus, man, this is important. We've got to work on this, our good reputation. We need to keep it. The second thing that doesn't really jump out at you in chapter 2, but I'm going to kind of shine a spotlight on it, is godly relationships. I think we minimize how important godly relationships are to us. I think when you notice somebody starts to have a problem with God, they start to pull away from God's people. Who you surround yourself with is important. Who you live with is important. Who you spend your time with is important. How do I know? Well, there's a couple of times that this word comes up that's kind of, again, translated differently in our modern English translations. But the word is cleave. Anybody know what that word means? Cleave? Cleave. To adhere to, yeah. Most of the time, where do you hear that word?
Cleave at weddings.
Weddings. Weddings, leave and cleave, yeah. And from Genesis, God says, for this reason you will leave your mother and you will leave your family and you will come together and you are to create new together. This idea of cleave means to bind together, it means to put together. It's an intimate relationship. Now, in the marriage issue, situation, context is a better word, let's put it in context. In the marriage context, okay? We're about 25 years, we get to it, let's see the last. In the marriage context, it also includes a physical intimacy. Okay? But the word doesn't have to point specifically to that union. The word means to come together, to commit. It's a lot like that loyal love that God shows us, okay? So the word cleave in Ruth is actually used a couple of times. When Ruth says, don't ask me to leave you, I'm going to stick with you. She's saying, I am pledging, I'm cleaving to you. Same word. When Boaz says, do not go to another field, stay in mine, follow these women, he says, cleave to them. I'm going to turn this off because I don't really think we need it. Do we need it? Can you still hear me? In the back there? Okay. So, what he's saying is, stick close. Stick close. Cleave to the servant girls. So, connection to godly people provides support and encouragement and strength in hard times. Connection to godly people. This cleaving, that's what I'd love to see this church be. When we're going through difficult things. When our mind might want to wander. When our feet might want to flee. I want all of us to see that happening and to run after them. Because when we get outside of godly relationships, we lose God. If you've looked around and noticed, and I know we've got these two different services and everything, but people that used to be part of this church and aren't part of this church yet, I gotta wonder, are they part of any church? Because when you lose the godly relationships, you can lose God easy. How do we live everyday faith? We gotta watch our reputations, because those open opportunities of influence, and we've got to make sure that we're sticking close to godly people, because when we're not close to godly people, it's a whole lot easier to become like ungodly people. If I still hung around with all of my college friends, guess what? I wouldn't be here. Thirdly, we gotta trust God. See, God's plan is working in your life. It might be viewed from your perspective or others as coincidence, but I promise you it's not. Look what God did for them. He provided for these two women widows beyond their imagination. He guided Ruth into this field. She was a foreigner that wasn't an Israelite. She is single, and God is going to break down every convention possible to provide a way for these women to have a future. And not just any old future. We're going to find out that Ruth and Boaz's offspring are part of the greatest lineage on earth. See, God is worth trusting. He's worth following. And to live everyday faith, we do have to watch our reputations. We do have to keep our relationships solid. But we also have to trust God's plan and purpose. Because oftentimes, we're just guided by God's grace. Just guided by God's grace. Which is a huge relief. You wake up in the morning, you don't have to wonder, am I in God's will? You just have to know that as you follow God, you're in His will. And it's working in your life. So the question is, are we trusting Him to lead us? Are you trusting God to lead you? And I think you are. think you are. So, if I'm trusting God that His plan and purposes are going to happen regardless, then am I watching my relationships and am I taking care of my reputation? Because if I am, then by living everyday faith, my life is creating an oasis of joy around me. It's creating an oasis of hope around me. It's creating an oasis of love around me. And that's called fruit. And if we're not bearing fruit, if we're not creating an oasis, then we might not have one of these things right here. We might not be living everyday faith. Because everyday faith creates an oasis of hope, joy, and love. Even in difficult places and times.